All right, welcome back everyone to this explainer. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to completely bypass the usual political rhetoric and figure out how to empirically measure a rising power's foreign policy trajectory. We hear these intense debates in international relations all the time. Everyone's arguing about whether a rising nation is going to uphold the existing global order or if they're going to try to tear the whole thing down. But how do we actually know for sure? Because let's be real, there is often a massive gap between what politicians say to the cameras and what they're actually doing behind closed doors. So, to cut through all that noise, we're using India as a really fascinating case study today. We'll be drawing on some groundbreaking research and hard empirical data to understand what truly drives a nation on the world stage. Okay, let's dive right in. So here's our agenda for today. We'll start with why actions speak louder than words, then measure priorities through leadership travel. After that, we'll look at strategic interest over ideology, the quest for symbolic equality, the role of public opinion, and finally, wrap up with the future of India's rise. Okay, so in international relations, politicians rely heavily on what scholars call cheap talk. Look, we all know it's incredibly easy for a diplomat to turn out some generic, perfectly crafted press release about, wanting world peace, regional stability, and mutual cooperation, right? Speeches at places like the United Nations are heavily scripted to sound absolutely perfect. So I want you to think about this. How do we actually measure what a country's government genuinely prioritizes? If we really can't trust the rhetoric because words are effectively free, where is the hard empirical data that reveals their true intentions? Well, to solve this dilemma, scholars Sumitha Narayanan Kutty and Walter C. Ladwig III argue that we really need to look for something called a costly signal. In the high-stakes world of diplomacy, a prime minister's time is an incredibly scarce resource. Literally, they have no free time. They face intense daily domestic pressures, looming elections, constant crises, the whole shebang. Because of that, choosing to physically leave the capital, board a plane, and travel overseas for face-to-face diplomacy is a massive costly signal. It is not just about the money being spent. Think about the brutal physical toll of the travel, the intense security logistics required, and the domestic political capital that gets burned while the leader is away from home. When a leader invests that kind of scarce energy, it represents a highly intentional decision. And that reveals their true global priorities way better than any cheap talk ever could. Moving on to Section 1, measuring priorities through leadership travel. To get past all that rhetoric, Kutty and Ladwig actually assembled an original, massive data set. They went in and analyzed exactly 226 bilateral country visits made by Indian prime ministers over a 28-year period, stretching from 1992 all the way to 2019. Now, this specific era is crucial, right? Because 1991 marked the end of the Cold War and the very beginning of India's major economic liberalization. By tracking the travel of 6 different prime ministers across this entire time frame, we get to see exactly where India decided to invest its absolute most valuable diplomatic asset. Seriously, just think about the logistics behind the number 226 for a second. The security briefings, the armored motorcades, the sheer mind-numbing jet lag of 226 international state visits. This is absolutely not a vacation schedule. It is a highly calculated strategy playing out over decades. So, by tracking exactly where these 226 visits happened, the scholars were able to test a really vital question. Is India acting as a status quo power, meaning it supports the current US-led international order and plays nicely by its rules? Or is it a challenger state, which we also call a revisionist state, that's seeking to disrupt and rewrite global governance? Just as a quick example to ground this, a status quo state is going to trade happily within the World Trade Organization, whereas a challenger might aggressively try to create a parallel rival financial system, or maybe unilaterally rewrite maritime laws. Now, Western policymakers frequently just assume India is going to naturally uphold the status quo simply because it's a fellow democracy, but as we'll see, India's actual travel behavior tells a much more complex and strategic story than that. All right, Section 2, strategic interests over ideology. Check this out. Notice how the historical Nehruvian consensus, which was India's deeply principled anti-imperialist solidarity with the Global South and the non-aligned movement, has basically been abandoned in the travel logs. The data clearly shows that modern Indian leaders are disproportionately traveling to major established powers and other rising powers. They are largely completely bypassing ideological kinship. Visits to the Global South and the G77 developing nations are happening with significantly lower frequency. They just aren't spending their most valuable, scarce resource visiting countries solely because they share a historical anti-colonial ideology. The crucial point that Kutty and Ladwig's data proves here is that pragmatic, sometimes even ruthless, strategic interests are what's driving India's foreign policy today.
India's leaders travel to major economic export markets and advanced industrialized countries specifically to fuel their domestic economic rise. They are aggressively courting powerful nations. And fascinatingly, the data also shows that a country's human rights record or its level of democracy simply doesn't dictate whether an Indian VIP will visit. Basically, if a non-democratic country is a vital economic market, the prime minister is going to go, for sure. It is a highly realist, calculated approach that prioritizes national strength and wealth way above ideological purity or bureaucratic routine.
So, this empirical puzzle brings us to our next really crucial question. If ideological kinship is effectively dead, and India is actively courting both the architects of the current global system and other rising powers, what exactly do they want? There has to be a deeper psychological need driving this behavior that goes way beyond just signing trade agreements and buying military hardware, right?
Which leads us to Section 3, the quest for symbolic equality.
To explain the why behind these incredibly targeted travel patterns, international relations scholar Rohan Mukherjee introduces us to something called institutional status theory. This theory is a real game changer because it unpacks a critical early window in a rising power's life. Long before a state actually has the overwhelming military might to just dominate globally, they encounter the existing international order. And during this really vulnerable phase, their behavior is driven by a deep psychological desire for validation and status. They want formal admission into the great power club. They want the managerial privileges that come with being recognized as a major player in global institutions like the UN or the World Bank. This early window is pivotal, and honestly, it's incredibly dangerous. Why? Because if their need for status is denied by the established powers, it breeds deep, lasting resentment. I want you to think about it kind of like a VIP room at an ultra-exclusive venue. As Mukherjee points out, great power status is an association good, meaning its entire value depends entirely on who else is already inside the room. A rising power like India cannot simply buy its way into respect by building a richer economy or a stronger military in total isolation. That doesn't work. They desperately need the existing club members, the established Western powers who are essentially acting as the bouncers, to unhook the velvet rope, formally recognize their arrival, and let them through the door. Status, at its core, requires mutual recognition.
Okay, let's pause here because we really need to draw a firm line between two distinct concepts: material equality and symbolic equality. A rising power in its early stages clearly does not have material equality. They just don't. They don't have the literal matching number of aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines or the exact same GDP as the established superpowers. But because they lack that absolute physical parity, they desperately seek symbolic equality. They want a permanent seat at the negotiating table. They want the prevailing social norms and institutions to recognize them as having equal role, status, and standing. This symbolic recognition is absolutely crucial because it compensates for what they currently lack in absolute material power.
So, according to Mukherjee, whether a rising power acts as a cooperative partner or a disruptive challenger depends entirely on two specific institutional variables. First, institutional openness. Are there actual realistic pathways for them to join the club? And second, procedural fairness. Are they being treated in a consultative, unbiased manner once they actually get in the room? We can frame this as a very clear choice for established powers. Look, if you invite them to the table and listen fairly, they become your greatest ally. But if you lock the gate and ignore them, they will try to kick it down. They'll adopt a challenger orientation to disrupt the very system that excluded them. All right, Section 4, the role of public opinion. Now, foreign policy obviously doesn't just happen in some theoretical vacuum governed only by diplomats. It is deeply, deeply tied to the people on the ground. Scholar Devesh Kapoor notes that historically in India, public opinion on foreign policy was basically non-existent. It was strictly an elite domain. But today, that has changed dramatically. Thanks to the absolute explosion of smartphones and a relentless 24/7 news cycle, India's rapidly rising urban, educated middle class is highly informed and very vocal. The media acts as a fierce, independent shaper of policy now. And because electoral competition is so incredibly tight, swing voters matter more than ever before. This means domestic voters can now actively constrain and dictate what those diplomatic elites can and cannot do on the world stage. Simultaneously, we also have to look at global public opinion to see how it shapes diplomatic maneuvering. As Kapoor highlights, if we look at the polling trends, U.S. favorability toward India was basically just middling for decades. But right after 2001, there is a very sharp, sustained spike.
As a huge percentage of Americans begin viewing India as a vital interest and ally over the last 2 decades, it created incredible reciprocal diplomatic opportunities. That positive public sentiment basically gave both nations' leaders the political cover they needed to forge much closer strategic ties.
However, international public opinion is definitely not uniformly positive. Kapoor points out that while the US and certain Asian nations view India favorably, BBC polling reveals highly negative views of India in several European nations like Germany and France. And this friction often stems from India's challenger tendencies on global treaties. For example, think about climate change negotiations. India's fierce need to industrialize its massive economy frequently clashes with Europe's desire for strict global emissions caps. These conflicting global perceptions make diplomacy incredibly thorny, and they really complicate India's quest for that universal great power status we discussed just a minute ago.
And finally, Section 5, the future of India's rise. When we synthesize Mukherjee's work with the data, a very clear pattern of institutional strategies emerges. When India feels the core Western institutions are open and fair, they try to reform them from within. This is perfectly illustrated by their decades-long persistent campaign to secure a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. But, and this is the critical part, when they are denied symbolic equality and feel those doors are completely closed to them, they pivot. They act as a challenger by creating parallel alternatives. A great example of this is joining forces with Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa to form the BRICS New Development Bank.
So, to summarize our explainer today, you literally cannot just listen to perfectly crafted diplomatic speeches. We absolutely must look at costly signals, like where a prime minister actually endures the massive physical and political toll of travel, to see that strategic power ruthlessly trumps ideology. We've seen that rising powers operate with a deep psychological need for symbolic equality in global institutions, and we've learned that you can no longer ignore the domestic, urban, middle class and media who are increasingly holding their leaders' feet to the fire.
I'll leave you all with this provocative final thought. The way the established world treats a rising power produces very real, very dangerous security externalities. If the Great Power Club refuses to reform and stubbornly refuses to share its status, are we inadvertently engineering the very international conflict and revisionist behavior we are desperately trying to avoid? Understanding this dynamic is absolutely critical for the future of global stability. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the data behind the diplomacy. See you next time.